board member, Tina Malcolmson, will introduce our panel.
Thank you so much for coming out today. And that was fascinating. I'm so glad we could hear from Bill and do such great things. Okay, my name is Tina Malcolmson. I'm on the board at Peace Action Maine and a professor of English at Bates College. And I'd like to introduce our panelists all together, and then they will speak for about 5 minutes each, although they could take more than that if they want. And after that, we will have another question and answer session. I'm sorry to have to tell you that one of our panelists could not be with us today because of unavoidable family issues. Chloe Maxman sends her regrets, and she hopes to collaborate with us in the future. However, we have a wonderful panel. Meaghan LaSala is the chair of the board of the Southern Maine Worker Center, a membership organization working to build a broad grassroots movement for the rights of the poor and working class people in Maine. She traveled to Paris in December to represent the Worker Center at the UN Climate Talks with a delegation of Frontline and Indigenous community groups. Can you hear me? Yeah. Called It Takes Roots to Weather the Storm. A recent graduate of the University of Southern Maine, she was active in the campaign to divest the University of Maine system from fossil fuel companies. The student-led group Divest UMaine succeeded in pressuring the system to divest direct holdings from coal companies last winter. Meaghan is also a founding member of the statewide coalition Maine Students for Climate Justice. Iris SanGiovanni is a third-year political science major, Spanish minor, at the University of Southern Maine. At USM, she is active in Divest UMaine's fossil-free campaign, Maine Students for Climate Justice, as well as a paid organizer for Students for #USM Future, a great group, I must say, and much more. Having grown up in South Portland, Iris was very active in the local campaign to protect South Portland from tar sands oil, and her efforts impelled her to continue organizing for climate justice and its intersection with Indigenous sovereignty and anti-racism. And if I may say, when Stan Scott talked to Bill McKibben in person, he brought up the South Portland movement. He was very impressed with that. Sherri Mitchell was born and raised on the Penobscot Indian Reservation. She graduated with a bachelor's degree from the University of Maine and received her Juris Doctorate and a certificate in Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy from the University of Arizona's James E. Rogers College of Law. Sherri has been an advocate for Indigenous rights for more than 20 years. She was a participant in both the American Indian Ambassador Program and the Udall Native American Congressional Internship Program. In 2010, she received the Mahoney Dunn International Human Rights and Humanitarian Award for research into human rights violations against Indigenous peoples. And she is the 2015 recipient of the Spirit of Maine Award for commitment and excellence in the field of international human rights. Sherri was a longtime advisor to the American Indian Institute's Healing the Future program and currently serves as an advisor to the Indigenous Elders and Medicine Peoples Council of North and South America. Sherri is an attorney currently licensed to practice in the state of Maine and several tribal courts. She has worked for the Solicitor of the United States Department of Interior in Washington, D.C., Frederick Peoples and Morgan Law Firm in Boulder, Colorado, and the Maine Attorney General's Civil Rights Division. He is currently the Executive Director of the Land Peace Foundation, an organization dedicated to the protection of Indigenous rights and the preservation of the Indigenous way of life. Chisholm teaches math, science, and social studies to 7th and 8th graders at the Friends School of Portland. Prior to becoming a teacher, Lee was an attorney for 14 years, practicing in Portland. Lee has a BA from Harvard and a JD from the University of Maine School of Law. Lee is an active member of 350 Maine and has been the convener of 350 Greater Portland since 2014. He was a nonviolence trainer and local action leader in Credo's Pledge of Resistance to the Keystone XL pipeline for 2 years preceding the pipeline's demise last November. He organized for the 2014 New York City People's Climate March, as well as the Jobs, Justice, Climate March of December 2015 in Boston, part of the Road Through Paris, and a host of in-state 350 Maine actions relating to tar sands, oil trains, and impacts of the climate crisis on the Gulf of Maine. He's also a member of ART, a fun, creative cluster of mid-coast Maine artists meeting monthly to create banners for a host of Maine nonprofit groups and causes. Please join me in welcoming our wonderful panel.
Do we have an order that you would like us to go in?
Yes, go in that order. Start with Meaghan. But it's up to you, really. It really is up to you if you'd like to change the order.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Meaghan. All right. Well, it's such an honor to be invited to speak on this panel, so thank you so much to the organizers, and definitely an honor to be Iris and Sherri and Lee up on stage. Value all of your leadership, so it's good to be here with you. And thank you all for coming. Was anybody here at any of the rallies against Donald Trump today here in Portland? I was watching it, I had to be at work, but I was watching it unfold from my computer, so I just wanted to give a moment of gratitude for whoever was organizing that. Because that potential future is definitely contradictory to building a climate of peace. So like Christina said, I recently returned from the Paris climate talks. I was there representing the Southern Maine Workers Center with a delegation of frontline community groups called It Takes Roots to Weather the Storm. And this was a really life-changing experience for me to be there with a delegation of folks who are resisting fracking in their communities, who are resisting waste incineration, who are resisting tar sands extraction, who are resisting oil refineries, who are resisting pipelines, who are resisting the transportation of oil through their communities in a myriad of ways. And it really gave me a new sense of sort of the strength of our movement, both on a national and an international scale. And I'm excited to get a chance to share just a little bit of what I experienced there. The demands that our delegation brought to Paris were these. These were our demands. We wanted to establish mandatory, not voluntary emissions cuts at the source. We wanted to leave fossil fuels in the ground. We demanded a rejection of fracking, nuclear power, and carbon markets and other dangerous and false technology solutions. We wanted to strengthen the inclusion of human rights, and particularly the rights of Indigenous peoples in the agreement, and we wanted to support community-rooted solutions, including regional and local economic structures that support the production of renewable energy. And I'll talk about this in a second, but pretty much down the line, none of those things happened. Quite the opposite in most cases. And this isn't a surprise, but it's something like Bill was talking about that sort of speaks to the moment that we're in and the magnitude of movement that we need to build to make this vision that we have a reality. So with the few minutes I have tonight, I wanted to say a few things about these demands. I also wanted to say who Frontline Communities are, or what Frontline Communities are, talk a little bit about my experience in Paris and what this phrase means, it takes roots to weather the storm. So what does it mean to be on the front lines of climate change? In case you haven't heard this term before, frontline communities describe those who are most impacted by climate change and the fossil fuel economy. And this is mostly people of color, Indigenous people, and working class communities. These are the communities that are hit first and hardest by climate change, and they're also the communities that hold the true solutions that we need if we want to transform society. So I think it's a fair question to ask, aren't we all impacted by climate change? The answer is yes. Climate change is definitely impacting everyone on the planet, and the urgency of the crisis can't really be overstated. But what we have to remember is that while these ideas of universality and urgency can be very motivating, they can also be double-edged swords. We have to be wary of rhetoric that tells us that climate change is the worst problem that humanity's ever faced, or that it's the most important thing that affects, because it affects all of us. The truth is that climate change is a symptom of violent systems like colonialism, racism, militarism, and capitalism that frontline communities have been resisting for centuries. So if we're not talking about these interlocking problems, we're not actually talking about climate justice. We already know that the urgency of the problem is going to be used to push through solutions that do more to undermine community rights than they do to lift them up. We saw this in Paris. The delegation I was with rejected the Paris Agreement coming out of the experience because it was a corporate crafted document that was more about preserving the right to extract and burn fossil fuels than it was about facilitating the transformation of society. The Paris Agreement puts forth carbon trading schemes which rely on the privatization of forests and the atmosphere. It also allows for false solutions like fracking and nuclear power. Basically, it maintains the status quo, and it's not an agreement for the people. Yes, it was definitely exciting to see world leaders finally agreeing that climate change is a threat, but now it's up to all of us to make sure that the momentum coming out of the agreement gets channeled into solutions that are actually about justice, about reparations, about love and transformation, and not about profit and control. So when it comes to addressing climate change, we need to talk about building up the power of working class communities and those communities who are already resisting the harm of the extractive fossil fuel economy. We need to look to movements like Black Lives Matter and the Not One More movement to end all deportations. Because addressing state-sanctioned violence against people of color absolutely has to be central to the climate movement. One of the most impactful experiences I had in Paris was participating in a demonstration outside of a detention center where migrants and refugees were being held before being deported. And that you should know that there was a surge of house arrests and deportations in Paris in the weeks following the terrorist attack in November. The rally outside the detention center was so beautiful. We got to hear from one of the detainees named Amir, who was inside but who was speaking through an interpreter through a cell phone. He told us, he was telling the crowd, "I'm not a criminal, I've never hurt anyone. I came here to protect myself." So ending violent and repressive border policies has to be central to the climate movement. And we're not going to be seeing those kinds of solutions coming through the UN process. So what did we mean by it takes roots to weather the storm? The Workers' Center recently joined an alliance of US-based frontline communities called the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, and that's who I traveled to Paris with. We are an alliance of organizations that are rooted in community struggles for justice and self-determination. At the Workers' Center, we're fighting for the human right to health care for all Mainers, and we're also organizing for dignity for low-wage workers. Through Grassroots Global Justice, we're uniting our struggles and connecting our local struggle to the international stage, and we're highlighting the national and the international implications of community-rooted solutions to the interlocking crises that we face. We need a new kind of economy, and we need the vision for that economy to come from the ground up. And I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A.
Hi, I'm Iris SanGiovanni, and I think a lot of what I'll be saying is going to sort of really echo what Meaghan was saying. But so yeah, I'm 21 years old, third-year student here at USM, and climate justice and climate justice activism, like what's my role in it? And a lot of it for me is like remembering the legacy that it holds, right? Like look at student activism and the power that students have held historically, you know, like that's really inspiring. But also in terms of climate justice, you know, looking at the legacies of like marginalized communities, like frontline communities. And for me, being so young, being white, I feel it's my role to really recognize and uplift this organizing and this legacy, because the immediate effects of the climate crisis, you know, those are being felt and are devastating communities right now, marginalized communities right now. And so like when I'm at school and I'm talking with my administration, right, about why we need to divest our endowment and like divest, you know, our finances from the fossil fuel industry, it's not, I mean, it's in doing so to support the organizing of impacted communities right now, right? And this crisis that we're in right now, just come to be for no reason, right? It was deliberate, and like so we need to really address the systems of like white supremacy, right? That have deemed certain communities like invaluable, that they can be burdened with the fumes, the oil spills, you know, like that are experiencing it right now. So
dance break.
Don't worry. So yeah, when I organized to end the fossil fuel industry, it's in doing so to confront white supremacy, right? And to say that all, you know, lives are mattered, and that's why it is so crucial to proclaim that Black Lives Matter. It's so crucial to acknowledge that the climate crisis has displaced migrants, undocumented. You know, like there cannot be one more deportation, right? Like all of these play into it.
I want you to go.
So it's really important to remember this legacy, and it's really what gives me the support in moving forward, and I always want to continue and extend that backwards. And there's a lot more I can say, but I don't want to take up too much time, and I feel like I'm sputtering here and there. So I'm going to give it to Sherri.
It's so beautiful for me to see these amazing young women stepping up to do this work. I first met Iris a couple of years ago when I was invited by both of them to speak at the Youth Climate Rally, and to see them really kind of stepping into their power as women is just a really beautiful thing to be witnessing. And so I'm so honored to have them sitting here beside me. So let's give them another hand. And selfishly, I love it because I'm tired. Kwe, Nida, sa Nida Pesks. Iltaliwis, Wanahawagasid, Najio Badawapskek, Alida Hazilu Undain. My name is Sherri Mitchell. I'm from the Penobscot Nation, and I'm honored to be here with you tonight. One of the things I want to start out talking about is this comment about this uprising of Indigenous people being a new thing. That's mythology. It's an illusion. It's what happens when we have an awakening and suddenly we see things that we hadn't seen before. In 1934, Felix Cohen, who was the architect of federal Indian law as it stands today, he was the writer of the Cohen Handbook on federal Indian law, which is still the most used and relied upon document in the field of federal Indian law, said that the Indian is the miner's canary, that what happens to the Indian will eventually happen to us all, and that the treatment of Indians is the signal from from fresh air to poisonous gas within our political system. The type of ecological genocide that is now being experienced all over the world began on the edges and in the midst of Indigenous communities. We have been facing this struggle for hundreds of years in some form or another, and certainly for the last 50 years here in a real accelerated way. And the reason that Indigenous people are now starting to get the attention around these issues that they had never before received is that these impacts are leaking out into the commons, and that other people are starting to be impacted by those things. And right now, the momentum is building because we have a nexus between Indigenous rights, environmental justice, and human survival. And so that's what's bringing us all together. All of our prophecies talk about a time when the planet was going to be in severe distress. And at that time, people would rise up from all races, from all corners of the world, and they would unite to make the planet green again. And so that's what we're doing. We're uniting, we're rising up from all corners of the world. We're beginning to see each other for the first time in our history. And I believe that we're all in this process of mass awakening. And for the first time in history, we're in the process of an evolutionary leap, and it's conscious, which means that we have the ability to direct the movement. We have the ability to determine the direction of that leap. And I think that that's really exciting. It's certainly a challenge, but I think it's an incredible opportunity for us to really bring forth our highest form of creative intelligence and be able to solve these problems together in a unified way. So even with all of the disturbing elements that this challenge poses, to me, it's a hopeful experience that even if we do not solve these problems and we exit the planet, as spiritual beings, we're going to exit the planet united. And to me, that's a beautiful thing. So, talking a little bit about what happened in Paris from the perspective of an Indigenous person who does this work on a really broad scale, I think that one of the things that was telling at the outset was the removal of Indigenous rights from the document. One of the things that we've been seeing in recent years is that there is a systematic attack on Indigenous rights all over the planet. The most powerful attack that we've seen in over 100 years on Indigenous rights. There's true termination policies that have been enacted and that are being played out all over the globe. And this is all connected to industry's desire to move unchecked across the planet. And Indigenous people have a set of unique rights that protects them, which makes Indigenous people natural allies for all those that are impacted by these things. Because we actually have lands that are untouched. We have protections that are unique. The importance of people standing with Indigenous people during these times is really critical to the survival of this planet. Because if we allow those lands to be taken, the last untouched, the last pristine places on the planet, because we're turning a blind eye to the plight of Indigenous people, then we actually sign our own death warrant. And that at this point in time, it's crucial to recognize the correlation between that and what happened in Paris. It's critical to recognize the attack on the Penobscot River that's going on right now and its connection to industry. It's critical to recognize that the taking of Oak Flat, the Apache sacred lands, and the giving of those lands to a French mining company is connected to the path that we're on. All of these things are connected to the path that we're on. The attack on Indigenous rights has really amped up since the discussions around the TPP have amped up. If you have corporations that can sue states and nations for their denial of profitability under environmental regulation or a number of other laws. Do you think that all of the laws that protect Indigenous people are going to be a hindrance to their profitability? So it's in the interest of those nations and states that are hoping to get passage of the TPP to start deteriorating those rights right now. So again, the Indigenous people are the canary in the coal mine. And what's going on with these issues across the world is indicative of where humanity is going, and it's really imperative for people to pay attention to that. So it's heartening to me to see that these issues are actually coming into the forefront, that people are starting to recognize what's happening, and hopefully there's still time for us to be able to resolve these problems together. The carbon credit market is, as Meaghan said, a false solution. It is a smoke and mirrors trick. It's a shell game. And the introduction of this proposed solution in the Paris talks, to me, demonstrated what an absolute sham the whole process was. Because this wasn't about finding climate solutions. This was about creating a market for our air. This was about the commodification of one of the last sources of our survival. They have commodified the soil, they have commodified the water, and now they're commodifying the air. And this is a fast track to the total destruction of our planet. And not only is it a sham because it's creating a market, but it also increases pollution. It increases pollution under the guise of it being displaced by someone else maintaining a piece of pristine land. Because what's happening is that it's resulting in huge land grabs all over the planet. The native crops in that area are being raised, and genetically modified crops are being planted. They've been included in this carbon market. We all know what big monoculture agribusiness does to the soil. It destroys the soil. So you have these natural habitats, these balanced ecosystems that are being destroyed under the guise of the carbon credit program. And in their place, they're putting things that are actually going to destroy our arable soil. So it's more destructive than it at first appears. It's also leading to the displacement and the removal of Indigenous people all over in Central and South America and Africa, and now they're pushing for a big carbon program here, and I'm very proud to say that my tribe unanimously voted against accepting carbon credits. So, there are a lot of there are a lot of things that we could say about all of those things, but I'm extremely verbose, and they've tried to limit my time here, and I have a few more things I want to get to. So I think that one of the things that we need to recognize is that, as Meaghan alluded to, this is not just a climate crisis. This is a spiritual and mental crisis. This is a crisis of the heart. And unless we're willing to look at it as a spiritual and mental illness, unless we're willing to look at it as a crisis of the heart, we're not going to have any ability to be able to resolve these issues. All of the issues that are connected to this that, me, Meaghan, Iris have talked about are all related to this crisis of the heart. And that as we try to address this challenge that we're facing, we have to be willing to face that challenge in a heart-based way. We have to bring the heart that's missing from this process into the work that we're doing, which means that we have to really look at the way that we do activism, and we have to look at the history of conquest that our ideologies have been built upon. And we have to start looking at the way that those ideologies are embedded into the way that we think about activism. Because we have to be doing love-based activism, and we need to stop doing conquest-based activism. This isn't about conquering the man. This isn't about tearing down and destroying so that we can just supplant one other system on top of another. This isn't about, I'm the good guy and you're the bad guy. And if we continue to couch it in those terms, then all we're going to do is continue the cycles of conquest that we've been living under for hundreds of years. And that conversation has got to change. So what we need to do in regard to that is we need to recognize that we are all part of one unified system. And we need to change the way that we define citizenry. We need to change the way that we look at the world in regard to these humanistic values. We've been very human-oriented in everything that we've been doing. We have to expand our ideas of citizenry to all living things. We have one of our creation stories says that we were born when Glooskap, who was the man from nothing, shot an arrow into the ash tree, and we all emerged from that space. What that reminds us is that that ash tree is our kin, that we were born of the same foundational elements that make up that ash tree. It's the same with every living and non-living thing on this planet. We're all stardust and water. We're all related, we're all interconnected, what we call Indilnabamuk. We're all kin. Indilnabamuk means all of my relations. It includes the entire creation. So we need to start thinking about that as we're addressing these issues and not look at the other as our enemy, but as somebody who's suffering from a spiritual and mental illness. And how would we treat somebody that was suffering from a spiritual and mental illness? And bring our heart into this process. One of the things that I think is really important as we move forward and we're trying to resolve these issues is to think about the fact that we've been operating under a truly imbalanced system. There are two energies that are in play in all systems of creation. We have a masculine energy and a feminine energy, and that's not gender specific. There is, the masculine energy is activity oriented, it's out there, it's external. The feminine energy is internal. And so we have stories that our clan system is structured upon these stories that we are told from birth on up about how the woman is brought, and this is purely for the sense of the story. As I said, these energies are not gender specific. The feminine is brought under the skin of the masculine. And what the role of the feminine is to connect that masculine energy to the wisdom and intuition of the heart and to the divine, because a woman's body is a gateway into this world. It provides a means for spirit to enter into this universe. And so what happens then is that all of the activity, all of the energy, all of the external movement of that masculine energy on the outside is guided by that heart-based, nurturing, life-sustaining, life-supporting, life-protective energy of the divine feminine that is inside. We have completely eliminated the role of the divine feminine and that energy, that heart-based, life-nurturing, life-supporting, life-sustaining energy from our decision-making for hundreds of years. And it's time for that to come back into play. And so as we start thinking about how do we address these issues, that has to be a part of the discussion. How do we reincorporate that so that we move away from a purely destructive movement to one that is actually based in creation? And so as we're moving forward, we have this word in our language called smogness. And what smogness is it is a term, one of our terms for a warrior. And it describes a process of holding back the flow of harm that is coming toward you to the degree that you prevent the harm, but you do not harm the other. You prevent the harm, but you do not harm the other. And I think that's a key part of the equation. We have to stem the flow of harm that's coming our way. But on the back side of that is this energy of creation, where we're creating the type of world that we want to inhabit. We cannot make a demand for any type of right without creating a world where that demand can be met. And so we as the citizens, we the people, have to take responsibility for creating energy sovereignty. We can't wait for somebody else to do it. We have to take responsibility for creating food sovereignty. We have to take responsibility for educational sovereignty because it's going to take critical, creative thinking to be able to solve these problems. We do not create critical, creative thinkers under the current educational systems. So if we want to be able to move forward, we have to be thinking about these types of things and incorporating that knowledge base to form the framework that we're operating under. And I think that we have grossly underestimated the power that we have when we're together. There's one more thing I'm going to tell you, and hopefully it'll take 90 seconds and then I'll be done. There's the story, a Guyana Shagoa that comes out of Haudenosaunee. It's the great law of peace. And one of the aspects of that story is that Hiawatha, who is one of the heroes of the story, along with Daganawida, who is the peacemaker, holds up his hand and says, something as simple as a human hand can topple this 150-foot pine tree. So in the story, there's a pine tree. The tree is uprooted, all the weapons are placed into it, and on top of that, a tree of peace is formed. And so he said, something as simple as a human hand, when it's working in unison, when it's all working together, all 5 fingers working together, can actually topple this great tree. And that great tree represents the lie of warfare that we have been fed. This lie that we've all embedded into our psyche that drives the way that we work. Even our nonviolence is violent, in that it's aimed at destroying a system that we no longer feel is worthy. So when we think about that aspect, that something as simple as a human hand can solve these problems, when it's together, when all 5 fingers are working together, that's representative of what we can do when we're all working together, so that we can actually uproot this tree that's dying and taking us all with it, and plant a new tree of life. And I think that the way that we do that is to focus on creation rather than destruction, to focus on what we have in common instead of what we disagree on, because whatever we feed grows. And we know that whatever we feed grows. And so if we want to actually grow the type of world that supports and sustains the dreams and the visions that we all have, then we have to really be focused on how we do that, how we invest our energy. So I'm going to stop there, but thank you so much for your time.
Well, as I've been sitting here listening to a great deal of heart's wisdom from all 3 of these speakers, I've been tempted to throw away my pages of well-prepared, well-thought-through remarks. And I think I'm going to do that and keep this brief. I captioned this slow violence, thinking of the context in which we're asked to speak. I think creating a climate for peace was the caption of the evening. The images of slow violence, as I thought about it, were things like leaf by leaf, stem by stem, wilting in Syria in its worst drought in 900 years, led to the depopulation of the farms, and people, family by family, one after another and another, beginning to fill the cities, and the cities unable to cope, and protests arising, forcefully put down, and a terrible war with many factions breaking out, sheer chaos. That was an image. But the slow violence of the drought that preceded it was what I focused on. Just 2 weeks ago, I read in the New York Times that the sea level has been rising faster than at any time in 28 centuries since the founding of the Roman Republic, I think around 500 BC. I don't know what happened then. But that brought to mind a wonderful thing. I'm sure some of you have experienced this, standing on a Maine shore on a windless, calm day, and just watching, really watching, as the water almost breathes upward. In just the flash of an eye, it's suddenly an inch higher because the tide is rising. You look at ocean rise, and that becomes a slow violence because of our warming. I'm going to read a section or two from what I prepared, and then I'm going to end with 2 images. In the Gulf of Maine, I noted, remarkable things have been happening. Clam flats have begun to go dead. Codfish have crashed. Shrimp have vanished. Lobsters are migrating north. The waters have been warming, warming, warming. Slow violence. And it's a violence to the natural order of things, to the fine balances and rhythms of nature. Just the other day, I was awakened in the middle of the damn night by a thunderstorm, a February thunderstorm, lightning, crashing, thunder. And Christmas Eve, I remember seeing a hatch of insects dancing in the late afternoon sun. A little bit later that same day, I had occasion to go into my art studio, and there was a dandelion popping its yellow head up out of the ground. Christmas Eve. Beautiful, but in context, slow violence. So here's the image, one of the 2 that I wanted to share. Meaghan. The Meaghan disaster involved a driverless train. Nobody steering, nobody in control. It had been parked around 11 p.m. that night in the village of Nain, the northwest of Meaghan. Around 1 in the morning, sleep time for most, through a concatenation of errors, culminating in a soft, gradual letting go of the air brakes, this hulking, headlightless, dark, driverless train began slowly and inexorably rolling down a very gradual grade, 1.2% slope. 7 miles away and about 350 feet below lay the unsuspecting town. 18 minutes later, that driverless train was careening through Meaghan at over 60 miles per hour, sparks flying, metal screeching, completely out of control. When it derailed, with explosion after explosion, the balls of fire were 3 times higher than the highest of Meaghan's buildings. And as the oil coursed, tumbling along the ground, it poured into storm drains and burst out as huge fires further on from manholes and basements and even house chimneys. Human bodies were vaporized. Some people's remains never were found. Meaghan is a powerful metaphor, a lesson, for where we stand at this moment in historical time. Undeniably, though there's a whole party that denies it, this climate is changing. The Earth's climate is moving. It's beginning to accelerate toward a catastrophic and irreversible harm. But this is the point. It's not completely out of control. Not yet. We human beings still have time to catch it, to board it, to bring it under control. How? Step by step. We do it step by step. Whatever step is right for you, whether dramatic and public or unseen and private, one step will lead on to the other. You'll be shown it, and another, until collectively, a collection of individual acts in freedom, a counter-momentum, not towards death and disaster, but towards life and peace and hope, begins to take effect. Indeed, it has already begun. We can all be part of it. We can all be part of it. That's the written part. Now the second image, and I'll stop. It struck me listening to Sherri and Iris and Meaghan. Words like a crisis of the heart, a spiritual crisis. I thought of Sarah and going to the healing walk in the province of Alberta in Canada. And I had the extraordinary experience of being in a teepee with a Native American pipe ceremony. In the middle of that pipe ceremony, invoked was not just speaking to the ancestors, but to the unborn, the children to be, spiritual beings, in the realm we just barely cannot see, but who are as there as we are there. The native wisdom knows that. So a child is born and comes into the earth. And by the way, today's children, a colleague of mine, a faculty member, just had a little guy named Gus born 2 weeks ago. Today's children, if we do nothing about the climate crisis, if we don't individually find that step that's right, which will lead on and show us the next step and the next, if we don't, these little young human beings are facing something perfectly dreadful, where all of the stuff comes together. All of the chaos breaks out. Not just the heat, but everything that humanity is capable of. But here's the picture. Think of how we're born. We are utterly helpless. I just finished teaching a unit of comparative human and animal science. And it takes human beings a full year to really get their legs under them, to stand up. When we're born, we can't even lift our own head. Think of the immense trust in one's parents, one's fellow human beings, that each one of us brings into the world when we're born. It will be all right. They are here for us. And we learn to put one step in front of the other that precedes speaking. And from speaking, we learn thinking. And eventually, out of that comes the word I. The word that, unlike any other word in the language, pertains only to something that only you can speak. So I think the climate movement is really one among many worthy movements, but it's certainly an important one. And it's so important that we find it in ourselves. What is the right step this morning, now, for me? Because the time of being passive is really past. Thanks.
so much. That was so wonderful. I'm hoping people have some questions for the panel. And can they use both mics or just, now they can use both mics. Any questions? I have a big question. So I think you're all great activists. And I'm just wondering if people would be willing to share something they do, some idea they had or a mode of action, a mode of proceeding that you thought brought success to whatever you were doing. If you could think of an example, I would love to, I think that would be wonderful to hear. Would you like to start?
Want me to start? Something that brought, for some reason, he's here in this room, founder of 350 Maine. I wasn't around because I hadn't activated yet, but he had, and called a rally, I think, and he was a crowd of one, with a whistle and a sign on the Casco Bay Bridge. That was the first step, and it grew. He can correct me if I've distorted this image grossly. I'm talking about Bob Clark's up there.
Thank you.
I think, for me, it was writing a letter to the editor immediately after Hurricane Sandy. I had been unbelievably frustrated by a whole campaign between Romney and Obama going on, where the Republicans would not speak the word climate change, and the Democrats were too afraid that it would make them appear fuzzy-headed liberals if they did. So not a word was debated in the entire time. I couldn't believe it. Everything was about the economy. It was all about the economy. Think of the damage that a climate catastrophe does the economy. Well, along came Hurricane Sandy, and within hours I was penning this letter to the editor, basically making that point, and I was just mad as hell. And that was only the first of, then, it brought me out of my, that's a personal, we all have our, anyway, I am convinced that the next step is, as you take one step, for the balance, the next gets revealed. And we're not alone in this fight. That's the other thing. We discover one another, and there is an unseen help that comes. Whatever you can dream, or dream that you dream, begin it. For boldness has magic, power, genius in it. It will help. The help will come.
I'm going to tell a story, but I first want to just mention that when Lynn was talking about those issues, why aren't we devastated and crying? Hear about these children and see them washed up on the beach from Syria. Why isn't it breaking our hearts? Because it breaks my heart. Why aren't we crying about human beings being vaporized? Why are we not crying together about it? That's part of the problem. And I think that, we need to stop being so desensitized to the immense tragedy that's unfolding all around us. So I just wanted to say that. And there's also this piece that I wrote a long time ago, like 15 years ago, where I talked about those future generations and that the urgency that we feel about these issues that we're facing is actually the call of our future generations beckoning to be born. It's actually their cries about having a world to be born into so that they can have the same privilege that we've had of coming here to learn how to live in harmony with one another. If we get it wrong, they lose that opportunity. So anyway, a story of success. One of the things that we do through the Land Peace Foundation is we teach strategic nonviolence workshops. We teach people who are on the front lines of some of these really controversial issues how to address them in real ways. It's more than just, standing up with a sign. It's about a real deep, long-term commitment, which is why Bob is still here, because he had a deep, long-term commitment to addressing these issues. People need to know how to create and actually move forward a campaign around these issues. And so we teach those classes to people. They also need to know how to engage the violence that is being aimed at them in the midst of these crises. So a colleague of mine, we went to a place called, there's a place called Elsiebuchtuk up near Rexton, New Brunswick. We went up to New Brunswick once and we went to Nova Scotia once because they were on both sides. Rexton is right in the middle of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And so there were people from both communities who were participating in these protests against hydrofracking. The thumper trucks were in the neighborhood. There was a lot of violent conflict that was rising up. There were snipers in the trees, part of the private militia that this corporation had. Ex-military special forces from the United States were part of that detail. And there was a lot of tension and people were getting hurt. There were vehicles set on fire, it was on the news, it was a mess. So we went up there and we trained 2 different groups of people on how to address that issue. The drivers of those thumper trucks who felt like they were being attacked were being accused of trying to run people over, and there was not a lot of love between these individuals who were working for SWN, this fracking company, and the individuals on the ground. So one of the things that we suggested was that you move the warriors, the young warriors who are in the front line of your movement, who are very angry, who are being very accusatory, who are saying you're evil, you're the devil, you're bad people, and you put your grandmothers in the front row. Put your grandmothers in the front row, you have them look the RCMP and this private militia in the eye, and you tell them, we're here because we love you and we love your children too. We're here because we don't want your children to be poisoned any more than we want our children to be poisoned. We're here because we want you to have a safe place to live and safe water to drink just as much as we want it for ourselves. And what ended up happening was one of those drivers, who may or may not have been somebody who was trying to run over these protesters prior to that, came to the location where they had the sacred fire, where people could go to pray or to get warm or to get food, who were out on the front line in this for months and months and months. And he came and he knelt down by that fire and he started sobbing. And he said, I don't want to hurt you. I just don't know any other way to make a living. I don't want to hurt your children, any more than I want somebody to hurt my children. If you show me some other way, I'll do it. I just don't know what it is. And to me, that demonstrates the great need for us to actually create something for these people who are just as victimized by the system as we are. We need to give them some place to move into. And it also demonstrates to me the power that love-based activism has to actually change hearts and minds. When somebody comes at you with their fist in your face, pointing at you, telling you that you're evil, that you're the enemy, your immediate response is to back up. When somebody comes to you and they talk softly to you and they're being kind, your immediate response is to lean in. If we want to change hearts and minds and reach a tipping point, we need people to lean in. And so to me, that was one of the greatest successes because it demonstrated all of those things. It demonstrated our needs and it demonstrated our abilities all at the same time.
So I'll also just say one quick thing about love-based organizing. So at the Workers Center, we use a human rights framework to help us think about how, as a movement, we can get at people's hearts and shift hearts and minds. And one of the things that I think a lot about, given the fact that our sort of cultural willingness to commit violence against the planet is so interconnected with, and I'm talking about white supremacy here, is so connected with our cultural willingness to commit genocide, to erase the genocide we've committed, to lock people up in cages, still on, okay, to sort of, is interconnected to our willingness to, commit violence against people every day. I spend a lot of time thinking about how to talk to my fellow white people about that interconnectedness, and recognizing that racism is still one of the most powerful tools that is used to divide people who would otherwise find things in common. I spend a lot of time thinking about that, and we spend a lot of time thinking about that at the Worker Center. We're a multiracial organization that's majority, our membership is majority white. We spend a lot of time practicing these conversations to sort of break down the barriers that come up that come up out of pain and hurt, and our sort of responses to pain and hurt, but that surface as this sort of like classic, us versus them. I'm going to get mine and screw everybody else. And using a human rights framework has been really helpful because we talk about the universality of human rights, and that it's helpful in breaking down those barriers that things like water, things like healthcare, things like education, these are human rights that we all hold by virtue of being human. And as soon as we start to draw lines around who gets them and who gets them and who doesn't, that's when our movements are weakened.
Okay, question? Okay, so let's thank our panelists so much once more. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming, giving us a tremendous amount to think about, a lot of it really moving, poetic terms of love-based action in the world. So thank you so much for that. Thanks again to Bill McKibben. He's a phenomenon, isn't he?
I did have a question, and I'll try to be brief. This has been very difficult for me. I'm 70 years old. I'm a grandfather. I think about the next generations very much. I personally feel the word that comes to mind is genocide. I'm a principal physicist of Eclipse Product Development Corporation. I have 25 patents to my name, about 22 of which I personally authored, about 19 of which were principally mine. I'm an engineer, I'm a technologist. To me, profits mean opportunity to develop things that we need. I hear profits under attack here. To me, the capitalist system, I see a battle between the small entrepreneur and the large corporation. I'm a small entrepreneur. I have pretty much devoted my life to trying to fight climate change. I first became acutely aware of it after graduating with a degree in physics and hearing a lecture in 1968. So it's been almost 50 years that I've been thinking hard about this. And I found it extremely difficult to get any help at actually implementing the kinds of things that we need. And what seems to be the focus here with relatively few people, when you think about the size of this community, is political activism and matters of the heart, matters of the soul, which I have. But I have to ask, how about technique? How about technology? How do we make things actually work? I don't see enough of that, and I think that's a whole other discussion.
Well, thank you for getting up and saying that. I'm 4 years short of your age. I don't have 20 patents behind me, and not even close. I'm a technological idiot. And I am so thankful for those who can and do contribute to what we need in terms of technology, a new energy system. There are already things that have begun, and there'll be more to come, and they're an integral part of this. We just have to have, and it's the small guys. It begins in one human mind. I'm practically living right now in a net zero school building, first of its kind, and the Quakers have built a wonderful little income. And that began, of course, there's still a model, that the architect, Phil Kaplan, put together. It all began here. And we all depend on that. And we're all grateful for it, even when we're not consciously grateful for it, because we're making use of it.
I think the reason why I'm talking so much about coming from the heart and building movements is kind of what Bill McKibben was saying, which is that we know that the technology that we need to transition to a fossil-free society exists. What's lacking is the political will. And I'm with Lee.
I say that's not entirely true. That's an oversimplification, and there's a huge lack at the actual detail in the trenches work of implementation, and I don't see that being addressed.
Okay, maybe you could let her finish.
I'll let her finish, but I think that just needs emphasizing.
Meaghan, I don't expect you to solve all the problems of the world here today in Portland, Maine, but I think that there is really a need to be realistic and to be honest about how this works. We all know how this works. There's a suppression of patents on technology that will change the way things are happening. It's not the people that are out here that are working hard to do these things that are suppressing those patents. It's not the people that are out here that are working hard to change these things that are blocking implementation. Part of the problem is that we have become a dependent species. We're constantly waiting for these people who are in leadership positions to provide us with the bow, what we need to do. We need to stop being dependent. We need to start implementing those things on our own. If you have technology that can help create this shift, then by all means, do what you need to do to implement that. Connect with the people you need to connect with in order to make that a reality. That's part of the sovereignty movement that we need. The issue of attack on profits, I think that we need to really look at that, because our whole society has been structured on a skewered sense of value. That we view success related to profitability. We view our ability to be able to amass more, whether it's money or houses or food or other sources of our survival that we've labeled resources. We need to actually radically change our value structure and really shift away from profit to purpose and start really thinking about how we do that. And in order to do that in a way that isn't totally disruptive to the way that people are living and the ability that we have today to survive, we need technology, but we need technology that's being based on ideas of heart-based movement and purpose rather than profit. And I think that if we're going to have these discussions, it's counterproductive for us to not be addressing each other as, human beings, eye to eye, breath to breath, heart to heart. We all need to be able to survive, to support our families. We have basic needs that we all share. So how do we engage discussions about that are not controversial and aggressive and accusatory? But how do we engage discussions about that really focus on those commonalities and how we can work together in order to move that stuff forward?
So I guess I could play the role bridging the gap between the physicists here and the political movement. When I was at UMaine for the last 3 years before I transferred here, I was a student of chemistry and physics, and I started a nonprofit called the Water for Me Foundation, which tries to address the clean water crisis in Honduras, Haiti, and Colombia. We've been able to travel, we've studied filters, we've also engineered our own prototype. And so to broaden this discussion, maybe you guys could talk about how foundations like this, which kind of serve as the liaison between the technologist and the political activism, can better work with each other. Any opinions on that, especially where you're talking about coming heart to heart, eye to eye, how that can actually start to happen?
First, I want to stand up and I want to acknowledge your contribution. I think that movements like this, what you're talking about, of course we have water crises right here as well, that they're fundamental to us being able to do this, whether they're structured under some type of corporate charter as a nonprofit or for-profit or any other way. Collaborations, cooperative efforts of human beings coming together to address these human problems in humane ways is the key to us being able to solve these problems rather than waiting for larger structures to solve them for us. So I think that it's absolutely key. It's at the heart of it. It's us doing the work ourselves, like you're taking the initiative to go and to do that work. That's how we're going to actually solve this problem in time, is by enough people rising up to do that work till we reach a tipping point where we're shifting our leap, our evolutionary leap, in a direction towards survival. So I think it's key.
So I work in renewable energy, and I just wanted to make a comment. There's huge amounts of progress that's happened in the last 20, 30 years. And also, because of the system that exists, profits are key to it. Like there was a big overproduction capacity in photovoltaic solar electric cells, and about a quarter of the big companies in the world went bankrupt in the last 10 years. So if they all go bankrupt, we don't have any more PV cells. So the system, because it's what we have right now, we have to realize these guys do have to make a profit or they go away. And for example, in Denmark, just to speak briefly about the technological progress that's happened, the economy in Denmark doubled in the last 20 years. Energy use remained the same. And right now they get about 40% of their electricity from wind, and they've committed to 100% renewable electricity by I think 2030, and 100% renewable heat, fuels, all energy by 2040. That's a nation of Denmark. In Germany, they went from almost no solar energy in their grid 15 years ago to, on a sunny day in the summer, last summer, 80% of the electricity in the nation of Germany came from solar power. So a lot can happen really fast, even with the current system we have. We just have to bear with it. Thanks for your help.
I wanted to mention that in the current issue of Union of Concerned Scientists, there's a very nice 16-point program on how to rearrange our food system to reduce inequalities and to reduce energy use. Very nice program that speaks to this. Briefly, the phrase coalition building has surfaced repeatedly and more frequently in 350 Maine, 350 Greater Portland meetings of late. We're finding our way like a jazz improvisational player. We don't have the ready answers, but coalition building is so important. And we just need to know of one another. The natural alliances will form. We just need to not be afraid to talk. Okay.
Well, I think we need to stop here because it's taken a long time, but if you have questions, please come up and
Well,
ask
can I
people.
just ask the panel the same question that I asked before about if they know of any kind of global fund since Sherri's with the Indigenous stuff, is that possible?
To my knowledge, there is no global fund. And I think that part of that question kind of feeds into this notion of Indigenous people being the ward of the rest of the world. It's kind of paternalistic, and what Indigenous people need is vocalized support. They need people to stand with them. They need people to amplify the stage for their voices to be heard. They don't need somebody in to come in and be, their savior. That started out with the black robes, and we all saw how that ended up. So I think that, thinking about this in regard to how can we be most helpful, it may not be a global fund to save the Indians. It may be really bringing light to the issues that are destroying their way of life and their ability to survive and sustain, as they have as subsistence and sustenance cultures for thousands of years. Indian people know how to sustain themselves. We just need people to allow us the space to be able to do that.
Well, thank you so much, and I have to stop it now, I'm sorry. If you would like a question, I'm sorry, I have to stop it now. If you'd like to ask a question, please come down. Thank you so much for coming and to the panel.
Thank you.
I want to hear your statement. I want to hear your statement.
I'm all ears.
What I ground myself in is that we cannot take our next breath without the other species of this earth.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It starts with that.
It does. It does.
And thank you for getting us all to advocates and into the sector. Because if you have
Yes, sir.